Okay, this movie didn't come to our town in any of the movie theaters we have right away, but it finally did, and I'm glad I got to see it because, honestly, I think I might like it more than Dope, which is a little hard to believe for me. Now, Me and Earl and the Dying Girl is a truly great indie flick by all stretches of the definition. Now, the true definition to an indie flick is by all means an independent film, but you can't deny that sometimes there is a certain style in the indie flick genre that makes it unique and something beyond than just being an independent film. There's a certain style that goes with them. And Me and Earl and the Dying Girl is no exception to that rule. Now, the main character in our film, the me in the title, is a kid named Greg. Now, Greg has found a system in the high school where he doesn't have to fit in with one specific clique. He's managed to find a way to become invisible to the students of the high school, as well as be good enough friends with them and pop in every so often, enough that he goes unnoticed when he's missed, but not become an enemy to everyone and classified in any specific clique. And it shows it in the movie. As he's walking around the high school, he puts in a small little comment within each different outcast clique in the high school, and he gets out. It's like he makes a comment and he quickly gets out before he's too noticed and too involved or attached to a clique. Well, towards the beginning of the film, he finds out that someone in his school has cancer. And so his mother forces him to hang out with this girl that he's just sort of an acquaintance to because, like I said, he's not attached to any specific clique. And so he starts hanging out with this dying girl named Rachel and starts growing attached and finally having a friendship and a bond with this other person. And so overall, this movie becomes a coming-of-age story for this main character, which I'm grateful for because I do love coming-of-age stories. There's plenty of good ones out there. Now, the Earl in the title is Greg's closest thing to a friend. He doesn't commit to saying that he's a friend, even though they've been hanging around since they were kids. But he doesn't really associate with those sorts of attachments. He's tries to be on his own, and he doesn't really commit to things, so he calls him his acquaintance or his co-worker, because him and Earl, they make movies together, and they make these spoofs and these ridiculously bad movies based off of very old classics and foreign film classics as well. And I have to say, it is a very fine, very great film. Now, of course, the acting is great by all three of these actors and most of the supporting actors as well. Greg is played by Thomas Mann, who I don't recognize too much. I know he's been in some movies that I have seen. He was in Hansel and Gretel as the sort of young apprentice that they take on that wants to be a witch hunter. Apparently he was in a movie that I had not seen and did not want to see at all, Project X. And I gotta say, he was great for our main lead, and he was awkward enough, subtly awkward enough where you can buy it as him being closed off to the world, but not to a point where it gets a little too quirky and too ridiculously out there. Olivia Cooke played the dying girl, and she showed some enormously great range throughout this movie, and she was very compelling. Very different from being in one of the most hated movies of last year for me, Ouija. She was in that. I don't even remember who she was because I just don't care about that movie at all. But I do remember her from The Signal, and she was great in that too, which is a very good, underappreciated movie. And Earl is played by R.J. Cyler, who really isn't in anything but this movie, and he's really good. Other actors and actresses that were very phenomenal as side characters in this film were Molly Shannon, who plays Rachel's, the dying girl's mother. She was hilarious and awesome in this movie. John Bernthal was really good as well. I hope I'm pronouncing that last name right. I should know him because he was in The Walking Dead. And he's not anymore, of course, but... And I've seen him in plenty other movies like Fury and stuff, but he was really surprising in this and really great as this history teacher. Yeah. And Nick Offerman plays Greg's father in this film, and he's played nothing like any of the characters I've ever seen him play, and he was hilarious and just very great in this film as well. He was like this stay-at-home father that watched movies, and that's where the kid gets his idea to make spoofs off of classic movies, because he reviews and watches classic foreign movies, and he's always bringing these weird foreign foods and stuff. He was like a hippie, and he always wore a robe, and it was pretty crazy. Now, I think it's easy to look at the description of this film and think The Fault in Our Stars. Now, I have to admit, I really enjoyed The Fault in Our Stars, and I think it's a 4 out of 5 star movie. But really, the fact that a girl has cancer in both films is the only thing that is similar to both films. It's very different from The Fault in Our Stars, where, like I said, it's a coming-of-age story. It's about a boy that is closed to the world that becomes more open to it with his relationship to this girl that's dying. The style is also very different in both of these films, where Me and Earl and the Dying Girl has a bit of quirkiness to it, like many other indie-style films. It has a lot of comedy sewn through the movie, but at the same time there's a very good dramatic pull and some great character development, and it's very focused on these teenage kids. Now, I gotta admit this because sometimes indie films can go horribly wrong from time to time. Sometimes for me, their quirkiness, their humor, and their visual style can become too much and a little too creative, to the point where it feels messy and random and just plain weird for the sake of being weird. Which at the same time, I gotta commend them for that because they're being their own film, but sometimes it gets a little too much for my taste. And when I started watching Me and Earl and the Dying Girl, I had a sense that it might end up being a little too over the top with its quirkiness and its artistic style and its strangeness. Like, there's these stop motion animation scenes throughout the movie of this character's thoughts, and one of them about a moose and squishing a squirrel and stuff, and sometimes it feels like, okay, this might get a little too much. So I was worried for it, but it never got too much and never got too artistic and too out there for me, and it was incredible. And of course, being a big fan of films in general, I really appreciated all the different references to classical films in this movie. Because like I said, Greg and Earl make spoof films of very classic and also very foreign films. And even though some of these films I had never seen before, and some that I don't consider to be some of the greatest films of all time because they're a little too old for me, I did recognize probably about 85 to 90% of all the films that they were referencing and spoofing off, and I just loved seeing that, and I felt some of those things were the funniest parts of the movie. So I think if you're a big fan of films and you know some of these classical films, I think you'll get a kick out of those parts in the film. If I really want to be nitpicky, and I have to say it because there was some moments where the film did make me a little uncomfortable, it has to do with some of the really long takes throughout the movie. Now, it doesn't happen too often, and it only really bugged me towards the end of the film, but there's some moments where the camera is on the characters a little too long and really needed to be cut. And I know that's a nitpicky thing to say, but for some reason, some of the scenes did make me uncomfortable, because there are scenes where there's a long take and no one's really doing anything differently. and it should have been cut a little bit sooner, maybe a few seconds sooner. Now, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but towards the end of the film there is a moment where our characters are watching a film that our main character has created, and that's all fine. And of course it jumps back and forth between the actual film he made with the reaction of the characters that are watching the film. And I totally get that. That's something I want to see. I want to see the reaction of the characters. And there's long moments where they're watching the movie and they're not really reacting too much to it. They're just watching, and it gets a little uncomfortable because there's some moments where it's just way too long and it's just weird. So instead of seeing more of the actual film that they're seeing, we're seeing their reaction, and they're just sitting. And that's probably just a little fraction of the long takes that are in this scene. And I get that it's not completely emotionless while they're watching the film, but there's some times where it's very subtle and there's very little reaction to the film, to the point where you just feel like, okay, just cut back to the film and show reactions when they're actually making reactions, you know? But again, that's a very nitpicky thing to say to something that I really do feel is a great film. So Me and Earl and the Dying Girl gets 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed it. It's probably one of my favorite indie flicks of 2015 so far. It is in my top 10 currently. And so, have you seen Me and Earl and the Dying Girl? Go ahead and comment. If you haven't seen it, what is your favorite indie flick of all time? And as always, this is Bruce Gifford, and this was Just My Opinion.